way of prefacing this, I'm going to talk really, really quick, and I'm going to skip over an awful lot because, as John said, this was a 17-year investigation, one of the longest, if not the longest, in the FBI's history, and we just don't have time to go into all of the bombings and all of the bombs. But suffice it to say that this task force was formed in San Francisco, and I had worked in San Francisco for the preceding 25 years, which is where I met Diane. And believe it or not, I used to be a lot slimmer and have as black a hair as Diane did. But over the years, things have changed. I'm glad to see it hasn't changed much with Diane. So anyway, the Unabomber case, in case you don't know how that acronym came up, is because this case was a major case in the FBI. Major case in the FBI just doesn't mean, it's not a generic term, it just doesn't mean it's a big case or an important case. It means certain things in the FBI as to reporting procedures, funding procedures, equipment procedures, investigative procedures, and so forth. So normally when a case becomes a major case, as this was, Major Case 75, it gets an acronym. If you remember back to the kidnapping of Patty Hearst, that case was a major case, and it was, the acronym for it was called HERNAP. The Oklahoma City bombing of the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City in 1995 or whatever it was, that became Oak Bomb. So this case became a Unabomber, and that's because the early targets of the Unabomber were universities, therefore the UN, and airline industry. That's where the A comes from. Put it together with bomb and it becomes a major case, Unabomber. Now, Diane can explain to you, in reporting back then, everything was by hand or by teletype, but mostly by letters. We called them airtels or memorandum that went by hand. And everything was dictated to a stenographer. And the stenographers had to type out the title. And as this case got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, you had to include every one of those bombings in the title. So the poor stenographer was repeating lots. We had 5 or 6 pages of title before you ever got to the substance of what the lead was or what we were requesting an investigation. So when it becomes a major case, every office, field office, at that time I think there were 57 in the FBI, was notified and given all the appropriate background information, so that when you sent a communication out, you just tell the stenographer who took your dictation on that airtel or teletype, whatever it is, Unabomber, Major Case 75, and it went that way. She didn't have to type all that stuff. So that has a significant meaning within the FBI. And this case became a major case back in about 1985, when the Unabomber sent or placed 4 bombs. That was his most prolific year. And it was the year that he first was successful, in his words, in killing an individual. He killed an individual named Hugh Scrutton up in Sacramento, a small computer store business owner who walked out into the parking lot going to a luncheon business meeting, saw what he had thought to be a road hazard, a bunch of, a couple 2x4s with sharp nails protruding from him right near his car. So he walked over to pick him up, and it blew up and completely eviscerated poor Hugh Scrutton. And in Ted Kaczynski's words, which we took out of his cabin later, he wrote, "Success at last. I finally found a way to humanely kill." Well, it was anything but a humane death, folks. It would be just like any of us walking out here and picking something up. So the following year, almost a year later, a little over a year and a month, another small computer store in Salt Lake City, the individual known as the Unabomber was seen for the only time in the 17 years. And that's where the artist's conception came from, the initial one. And he placed the exact same device from the previous year that killed Hugh Scrutton beside the front tire of a young lady, Tammy Fluey, who was working at this computer company. Unfortunate for him, Tammy was Xeroxing and looking out a window, and her car was parked right up against that window in the parking lot. And she saw this gentleman come in with that gray hooded sweatshirt, aviator sunglasses, and kneel down beside her car and take from a white canvas bag the same device. 2 2x4s nailed together with really shiny nails protruding. And she looks down. She's right here. He's right down there. She's watching him.
Wow.
And she turned to her boss, who's named Gay Wright, who was the owner of the company. And Tammy was a young lady who didn't mince words. And she turned to her boss, Gay Wright, who was across the room. She said, "Hey, Gay, come look at this asshole and see what he's doing." And Gay came over and looked out, and there he was. And she said, don't worry, I have one of my sons go out and get that. Well, in the meantime, he calmly got up and left. And one of her sons, indeed, did come back to the business, Gary, and he walked over and picked that device up. Unlike Hugh Scruton, Gary Wright had a back problem. And instead of bending over from the waist to pick it up, he knelt down beside it and reached out. And when he did, it blew up with a vengeance. It blew wood and shrapnel up his nose, into his face, all through his arms, severed nerves in his arms. Gary still doesn't have full use of his hand today. But what we know now from the writings we took out of that cabin up in Montana is the Unabomber was frustrated. Why had he not been able to kill effectively a second time? So he quit bombing. And from 1987 to 1993, we didn't hear from the Unabomber. Nothing. Everybody said he went to jail. He died. He got religion. He just got tired of bombing. He's gone away. Closed the case. But we had an agent in San Francisco who wouldn't let the case be closed. And we had a sheriff's deputy up in Sacramento who got a call weekly from Hugh Scruton, the one gentleman who'd been killed, asking if any progress. Every week for 5 or 6 years. He said it can't be closed. So it was kept open. In June of 1993, all of a sudden, we heard from the Unabomber again. A bomb arrived in Tiburon at the residence of a gentleman named Dr. Charles Epstein. Dr. Epstein was a geneticist working up at the University of California, San Francisco, up on Parnassus Street, doing research on Down syndrome. He was an internationally known researcher for Down syndrome. He came home and his daughter had brought the mail in, an adult daughter, and left it on the kitchen table for her dad. He walked in and he was confronted with an envelope, a jiffy padded envelope that we all know, we get them through the mail all the time. It had a red, white, and blue mailing label on it. It was addressed to him, but it had a return address he didn't recognize. Who in the world is that? So being inquisitive, he pulled the string or the device that opens that envelope, and he said that's the last he remembered. He heard a hissing and saw a flash, and the thing blew up. It was the size of a VHS tape, much smaller than previous bombs. And Dr. Epstein lost most of the fingers on his right hand. Dr. Epstein was also a concert cellist. He never played the cello again in his life. Now, all the way across the country the following day, Saturday, a gentleman named Dr. David Galerter, who was a very well-known computer scientist at Yale University. He came up with a parallel process called parallel processing and so on and so forth. Very well known in the computer industry world. He came back to work after being gone for a week and was confronted with the same type of envelope. He didn't know anything about Tiburon bombing, and he opened it up too. Did the same thing to him. It blew all the fingers off most of the fingers off both of his hands. He almost bled out. He ran down 4 flights of stairs and across campus, because it was on a Saturday, all the way to the infirmary. When he got to the infirmary, he had no blood pressure, and I forget how many units of blood. They had to replace almost all of the blood in his body. But he survived. Monday morning, an editor at the New York Times, Warren Hogue, came to work. He was a fashion editor of all things. And he had a letter. And the letter said essentially, it was typed on an antique typewriter. And the letter said, "Hi, I'm FC. If you don't know who FC is, ask the FBI. They refer to me as the Unabomber. I just want to let you know that I'm back and I'm beginning my campaign of terrorism and I'm going to begin killing people again. I'm not going to use the moniker FC anymore. I'm going to use this secret number to validate any future communications." And he gave what appeared to be a social security number. Now, I have to back up a little bit because it's hard to tell the story without connecting all the dots. The only piece of forensic evidence that we had that was going to connect anyone together over this 16-year period was that all communications, with the exception of one, had been typed on an antique Smith Corona circa 1925 to 30 typewriter with pica-style type and 2.54 spacing. It was exact from the very beginning to the letter that Warren Hogue got in New York. Previous to 1985, when this case became a major case and got an acronym, the individual responsible for all the bombs was known as the junkyard bomber, not the Unabomber. He was known as a junkyard bomber because all of his bombs were fashioned out of things that you could find on a construction debris pile. He didn't go to Radio Shack and buy switches. He didn't go to the hardware store and buy pipes. He didn't buy explosives in the sporting goods stores. He made everything. But in '85, they changed it to a major case, and the acronym became Unabomber. And that's what he's referring to. That letter to Warren Hogue was typed on that typewriter. Now, I don't know what your politics are, but I always seem to judge the people that I work with based upon their merit. And at that time, we had a brand new, June of 1993, a brand new Attorney General, Janet Reno. In the 31 years I worked in the FBI, I can say unequivocally, Janet Reno was the best United States Attorney General we ever served under. She's a former prosecutor and she understood. And she saw the construction techniques on those two devices and the threat that he made to the New York Times, and she said, "We got to solve this case." So she said, "I want a real task force. Not a make-believe task force, but a real task force. All of the agencies working together under one roof for one boss." And she went to the director, brand new director of the FBI, Louis Freeh, and asked for his concurrence and asked if the FBI would head the task force. Now, at that particular time, not now, it all changed after 9/11, but at that particular time, bombings from a federal investigative standpoint were under three agencies. Bombs on university campuses as a result of the 60s and the 70s turmoil were exclusively the jurisdiction of the FBI. Bombs placed aboard aircraft because of all of the hijackings and the stuff in the early 70s and the late 60s, exclusive jurisdiction of the FBI. We had bombs in both categories. Bombs that go through the mail were the prime jurisdiction of the Postal Inspection Service. One of our bombs went through the mail and blew up aboard American Airlines Flight 444 bound from Chicago to Washington, D.C. So it was concurrent jurisdiction between the Bureau and the Postal Inspection Service. So the Postal Inspection Service had to be involved. And then if we walked out on the street and we encountered a device laying out on the street somewhere, the final jurisdiction on that bomb was the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, along with the local agencies and so forth. Three different agencies. So she got the concurrence of the Secretary of the Treasury, Lloyd Benson, under whom ATF was at that time. She got the concurrence of the Postmaster General, whose name I never can remember, and got him to concur. And she got Louis Freeh to say, "We'll have the task force, and we will head it." And this won't be a task force where people will come and go from. It'll be one task force under one roof of agents and postal inspectors working for one boss at his direction. He being Louis Freeh, a former boss of ours from San Francisco, George Cloud, to head the task force. George was a former chief inspector. He was, at that time, the chief inspector of the FBI. And he said, George, I want you to establish the task force. Now, most of the devices at that time had come through or been mailed from Sacramento. But George elected to put the Unabomber task force in San Francisco because we were a much bigger office with a lot more resources, a lot more office space, a lot more support employees, and George felt more comfortable establishing it there. So George came to San Francisco in late June, early July 1993 to establish the task force. At that particular time, I was just coming off of several high-profile involved investigations. This wasn't the only investigation of this kind I've done. So 2 years before, I had just completed being the co-case agent on a case that you folks down here may be familiar with, where for one of the first times in history, my partner and I convicted a sitting federal district judge, Robert P. Aguilar of San Jose, who my partner and I referred to as His Honor the Felon. So that was a high-profile case that was under Mr. Clow's supervision as our assistant in charge. He liked the work we had done. I was in the Bureau terms, riding on a high. I had over 25 years in the Bureau. I was allowed to commute to Oakland from my home, which was 15 minutes, and come to the city on Bureau time as opposed to my own time, later when the commute traffic, doing what I wanted to do, working with one of my best friends as my supervisor, and I called it in the Bureau, I was posting and coasting. Means I was writing stuff up on files and having a great time. George got to San Francisco and the long arm of a supervisor reached out and said, I want you. So now, for having done some good work, I got to commute an hour and a half each way every day. I got to work 10 to 12 hours routinely every day. I didn't have any vacations or times off to solve what had heretofore been an unsolvable case. Now, when we, being the Bureau, did the examination of that letter that went to Warren Hope, one of the first things that they found when they examined that letter was it was typed on an antique Smith Corona typewriter, Pica style type, 2.54 spacing. But they also put it under a supersonic electron microscope and they found indented writing. Remember when you were a kid and you had your super secret spy kit? And you wrote on a piece of paper and then you went down 5 sheets underneath and you went with your pencil and this writing appeared? That's indented writing. And on that indented writing, it said, call Nathan R. Wednesday, 7 p.m. We interviewed everybody at the New York Times. Did anybody take such a note and not know that that letter was underneath and printed on there? Nobody admitted to having done that. So the presumption was Unabomber had written that note to himself and didn't realize that the writing would be indented on that piece of paper that he used for the letter to the New York Times. Okay. Now, first thing that task force did, we said, what can we do to encourage help from the public? We're no different than FBI agents for the last 30 years, 20 years. We're no different than ATF and postal inspectors for the last 20 years, and we haven't solved it. We're the same. What can we do differently to solve this case? We said, how about let's offer a reward? Great idea. How much money would cause someone to come forward? Because you can't do these things in a vacuum. Somebody's got to know about it. How much money do you think? How about $1 million? Great idea. Guess what, folks? Congress, in its infinite wisdom at that time, did not provide the ATF, the FBI, or the Postal Inspection Service with reward money. So in order to get $1 million, we had to go out to the industries involved. Universities, airlines, medical people, computer companies, and get signed contracts pledging money if and when a person came forward with the information that would lead us to identify, arrest, and successfully prosecute a person known as Unabomber. It took a year to do that, guys. That's manpower intensive. Then we said, how does the public get that information to us? And how do we know about it? How about we'll establish a 1-800 toll-free number. We'll staff it 24 hours a day. And we'll tell the public they can call in and they don't have to give their identity. We'll give them a secret number, only known to them and us. And if the information that they provide lead to the identification, the arrest, and the successful prosecution, they'll qualify for $1 million rewards. Great idea. Manpower intensive. Do you know how many telephone calls we got on I can tell you, well over 53,000. Every one of those has to be investigated. The information has to be looked at seriously and investigated. That's manpower intensive, let alone manning the 800 number all the time. How do we get that information out to the public? Okay, the director of the FBI, and the director of the ATF, and the Postmaster General had a national press conference in October announcing the task force, announcing the reward, announcing the 1-800 toll-free number, and they needed to stimulate it to get the public to come forward. We've got to give them something that they can hang their hat on. So we announced the existence of the Nathan R. note. And we were drawing our attention specifically to people with the first name of Nathan, Nate, Nathaniel, Nat, and what have you, and a last name beginning in the letter R. Call us and let us know. Okay? Good idea. Now we followed up on that. You'll be happy to know that in 1993, there were over 8,500 people in the United States with the first name of Nathan, middle name Nat, Nathaniel, whatever, any derivative thereof, and the last name beginning in the letter R. Over 8,500 of them. Then we knew where the Unabomber had been in certain times because of where he postmarked, where things were postmarked, and where bombs were left and what have you. We identified every one of those people in those areas. There were 3,500 of them. And we interviewed all of them. Do you know anyone who might fit the bill of this? Didn't have anything to do with anything, we found out in the end. But we had to do it. We were compelled to do it. Then we decided we've got to get all of the files from all of the agencies. All of the federal agencies and all of the local agencies. And we've got to combine them into one file in one place. You have any idea how big the Unabomber file is? The physical file as a result of bringing all that information in from all over the United States? It was over 59,000 volumes of information. Each volume contains over 200 serials, 200 documents. If you multiply that out, that's well over 11 million documents. Do you know how agents and ATF and postal inspectors were trying to solve this case before that? 3x5 index cards and little square boxes on their desk. So we computerized all that. We had to get our rapid start case management people to come in. And then we had to get an investigative full text retrieval program to download documents that were of significance from the investigation. Labor intensive. It was over a year to do all of that. We did a whole bunch of other projects, forensic projects, and so on and so forth. And we just couldn't solve the case still. But we were putting together the building blocks that would allow us somewhere down the road to identify a person who would have some knowledge of what was going on with a relative, a friend, or so forth. People say to this day, they say, it was easy. What the hell's wrong with that FBI? It was easy. His brother told you who it was. If you want to come up afterwards, I'll show you a report here that our analyst did for us. So did 59 other brothers. The interesting part of that was we had 230 some former wives identify their ex-husband. Nothing particularly to do with it, but just on the outside chance, the SOB may be him. You know? It was amazing the people that were coming forward. sincerely and so forth. But it all has to be looked at. It has to be looked at seriously and investigated seriously. And in that first year, we did forensic reanalysis. We did the computer. For the first time in history, the Bureau used the internet. We went up. I didn't even know what the internet was, for God's sakes. We got computers to look at all this information. I never used a computer in my life. And most of the investigators were old guys like me. So we had to be trained on how to turn the computer on and off. That was a big deal for me. I learned one thing, and I told our IT person a couple weeks ago that I had fortune to communicate with the Clear Blue Sky. I told her I still use one of the first things she taught me when I was having trouble with that computer. She said, "What's that?" I said, "Do a hard reboot." And I do it to this day, you know. And it was very apropos. So it took a whole year to get all this stuff into the condition where we could actually do something proactive to try to find this person. And in the meantime, he kept bombing. And by the following spring of 1994, as most task forces, it started to break up. People started getting promoted, people started being transferred, and agencies started failing to replace people. And pretty much the task force reverted to manpower and support people of the FBI. And I say that very proudly, folks. There's only one agency that could ever have had the stick-to-itiveness, had the resolve, and what have you, to bring this case to a successful conclusion, and I believe firmly that's the FBI. At that time, the case reverted from a task force case to control of the San Francisco division of the FBI. And my boss, Jim Freeman, who's one of the co-authors of the book that we wrote, went to Louis Freeh and asked to take over the case. Special agents in charge don't do that, folks. They don't go out of their way looking for work, particularly of an unsolvable case. So Jim took over the case. And I saw it as an opportunity. I'd been there for a year. I did what I was asked for a year like a good soldier. I just want to go back to Oakland and be allowed to post to retire. So I immediately submitted a memo to that effect. Jim immediately turned me down. And he decided, you know, I have to take a different direction with this case. I'm going to appoint a supervisor to oversee this case who doesn't come from a criminal investigative background. Back at that time, the FBI had two divisions, one criminal and one foreign counterintelligence, security work, FCI. We called it security back then. And security agents are a lot different than criminal agents. You can go in the office and pick them out. Criminal agents are short, fat, dumpy little guys like me whose clothes are all rumpled from sitting in cars all day and doing leads and what have you. Or security agents who are analytical, wearing Brooks Brothers clothing, look like they just stepped out of the haberdashery and what have you. They're neat and, right? Diane, you'll back me up on this. So he said, I'm going to get a foreign counterintelligence person to head this up. And he did. He appointed a good friend today, another co-author, Terry Turchi. Terry was the supervisor in the Palo Alto resident agency. Foreign counterintelligence, looking for Ruski spies and stuff like that, okay? I still remember the day, and it's documented in the book, that I got a telephone call. And this sweet little voice on the other end of the line, who's sitting right down here in front of you, said, "Hey Max, it's Diane. I heard that you and Terry Turchi are going to be working together." And she started laughing. And I said, "What?" She said, "It'll never work. It'll never work." And Diane knew. Terry and I are dynamically different personalities. Terry is very introverted, very analytical, very reserved. He wouldn't say crap if he had a mouthful. And on the other hand, I'm more outgoing, if you haven't noticed, boisterous, okay? And Diane didn't think it'd work. Well, guess what? It worked perfect. We had the two opposites. We commuted together every day. I would sleep in the morning while Terry drove. He would sleep in the afternoon while I drove. Terry used to say that I had a conversation going before we hit the Bay Bridge, and when he woke up at his home in Danville, I'd still be talking about the same thing. So we worked and were compatible very much together. So they reorganized, but the bombings continued, and they got better, and they got more sophisticated. And a gentleman all the way across the country in East Caldwell, New Jersey, named Thomas Mosier, who was an advertising executive for Young and Rubicoff, was blown apart in his East Caldwell, New Jersey home. Absolutely blown apart. The bomb was very sophisticated and very deadly. 1-inch green paneling nails, double-edged razor blades, shrapnel, and so forth. It killed Mr. Mosier immediately. And so we threw more manpower at it. And we got more support employees in here. We got analysts, and we were doing all kinds of work round the clock. And the day after the Murray bombing in Oklahoma City, a gentleman up in Sacramento came back to the Gilbert Murray, to the Forest Service, California Forestry Association's office, which was a lobbyist for the lumber industry, had a package. And the secretaries had been paying attention to what we'd been saying in the news and on putting out. It was heavy. It didn't have a metered strip on it. It had excessive stamps as postage. It had a red, white, and blue mailing label, which had old typewriter typing on it. It had priority mail stamps stamped all over it. And it came from a return address that no one knew. And the interesting thing is, it was addressed to Gilbert Murray's predecessor, William Dennison. William Dennison had been the lobbyist there prior to Gilbert Murray taking over. And William Dennison, if you remember, you may not, but it relates down here, William Dennison was very outspoken. And at that time, there was the big feud going on between the Environmental Liberation Front and the timber industry to save the old growth redwoods up in Northern California. And they were down to their last leg of what to do to try to get this old growth redwood saved. So they came up that that's the habitat of the spotted owl. So you can't cut down the trees because it'll endanger the spotted owl. William Dennison showed up, and this is a true story, folks, showed up over here at Stanford to give a speech. And of course, the ELF people were all over him, and they were protesting and what have you. And he introduced, at that conference, the new book that he had authored called The Spotted Owl Cookbook. Elf was not impressed by it. And they had to physically escort him off campus with a police escort to get him out of the area to protect him from those people. So it was addressed to him. Gilbert Murray's secretary's receptionist said, Mr. Murray, this is addressed to William Dennison, but it has all the earmarks of those things the FBI's been talking about. Maybe you ought to call him in. Nah, don't be silly. And it was a shoebox-sized package. So he walked back to his office, and he opened it up, folks. And I wish we had time to look at the crime scene. It literally blew him apart. His body had no clothing left on it. The force of the blast was so intense. Killed him instantly. Ted Kaczynski wrote later, well, I really don't care that I killed Gilbert Murray and that he was a great guy and a really nice guy. He was probably a more effective lobbyist than his predecessor had been. So he hadn't solved it yet. And then in the spring of 1995, we received a couple significant things. We got a letter to the Chronicle, typed on the Smith Corona 2.54 spacing, packet style type, 1925-30 typewriter, that said, hi, I'm the Unabomber, or here's my validation number, I'm going to blow an airliner up out of LAX over the Memorial Day weekend. And we knew he had the ability to put a bomb on a plane because he brought a plane down from Chicago to Washington, D.C. with no problem by sending it through the mails. All the mail that left Southern California went out by truck, folks, and it went from the LA area to the Phoenix area where a big warehouse was set up with magnetometers and explosive devices to tell us whether the package is set before they ever re-entered the mail stream. Confusion. A week later, he wrote back and says, I was just joking, I would never do that. But in the meantime, he sent what we referred to as the Unabomber Manifesto, a 35,000 word document. If you have insomnia, get a copy of it and read it. It'll put you to sleep. But what he did was, he demanded that this be published in a legitimate publishing format. Either the New York Times, the Washington Post, one of the large magazines, Scientific American, or, as all good terrorists would demand, Penthouse. So he put it on the same level as the New York Times. So, you know, he wasn't all crazy. So anyway, we got to decide what to do. It was typed on the same typewriter. What do? Publish or not publish? We got to decide that. The Attorney General came out and said, write a position paper as to what you want to do and bring it to D.C. to Jim Freeman. We had a meeting in our office in San Francisco of the senior management team of Unabomber. What do we do? And the existing thing was, we don't give in to the demands of terrorism. We can't publish it. Jim said, okay. And then Jim said, I got another appointment I have to go to. Write the position paper, have it ready for me when I get back later this afternoon, and Terry and I will take it to D.C. tomorrow. Now, the boss leaves the room. Now the real discussion can begin, and people can talk honestly without fear of retribution. And guess what? We decided we had to publish it. We got to publish it. We've been looking for something that the public can hang their hat on to read and get back to us on the 1-800 number and to come for the reward. Because there were certain things in that manifesto that we knew to be unique. I thought that was mine. You got the same ring as me. To be unique. Unique spellings, unique idioms, and so forth. So we decided to publish it. And we wrote the position paper. Freeman came back later that afternoon, walked in and said, you got the paper ready for us? We said, yes, sir, boss, we sure do. He said, okay, give it to me. He said, well, there's one little problem. He said, what's that? We said, well, we changed our minds. We want to publish. And he agreed with us 100%. He and Terry took it back to headquarters. And we talk about this in our book here. You guys have no idea. If you just had to do an investigation, it'd be easy. But you got to deal with all this internal bureaucracy and crap that goes on. I'm being honest, you know. They walked in back there, and of course the senior bureau management was, Freeman, we know you're not going to publish, right? And he said, oh no, we are. What do you mean? You know, they were appalled to think that we would suggest that. Well, guess what? Louis Free agreed with us, as did Janet Reno. But now we got to get it published. 35,000 words. That's a supplement to a newspaper. That's costly. We don't have money to pay them. So we went to the editors, the Attorney General, the Director, Freeman, Turchi, and our psychologist, Kathy Puckett, and presented it to the editors of the New York Times and the Washington Post, and asked them to publish it. They didn't want to be in the position of being an agent of the FBI. We had to convince them that we were doing this for a public safety thing, that this would probably keep more people from being killed. And they agreed. And now we had to agree who's going to do it. Well, we agreed on the Washington Post, and we agreed to do it during the week. Have any idea why that was? The New York Times has a publishing facility right here in the peninsula. They publish thousands of papers every day. The Washington Post sends, they thought, about 24 papers into the Bay Area on a daily basis. And they were at places like Herald's Newsstand and several other in San Francisco. The behavioral profilers, who I don't have a great regard for, told us that Unabomber is going to thirst for a copy of his manifesto in the Washington Post or the New York Times. He'll run right out and buy one as soon as possible. Okay? So we elected to have the Washington Post do it because there's a limited amount of copies in the Bay Area. And we believed that he was living within a 500-mile radius of San Francisco. So we set up on all of those places. Video surveillance, physical surveillance with our SOG units, our surveillance units, And we identified everybody that was coming in and buying a copy, and we looked at them as a possibility of being the Unabomber. My suggestion that they wouldn't allow was, we buy 24 to 25 copies, and the one copy's got to be the Unabomber, but they wouldn't go with that. So we had to do that. And there's a couple of stories in our book about that, and the extent to which some agents went to get it right. Ted Kaczynski could care less. He'd get his copy later. He wasn't about the first for getting his copy in print and being validated, you know. He knew it was done, and that was all that's possible. But again, it was labor intensive and didn't solve anything. So it's published. And we're getting all kinds of calls on the 1-800 number. David Kaczynski, Ted Kaczynski's brother, and his wife, Linda Patrick Kaczynski, were out of the country. They were on a European vacation. And Linda Patrick Kaczynski, in my estimation, is a true hero in this case. Everyone says, oh my God, his brother turned him in and it was great. Well, it was. I had trouble turning my brother in. But Linda had been paying attention to what we've been saying all along. And she knew what violent ideas her brother-in-law had and how he'd expressed them. And when they got back home, Linda went to work and got on the computer. They didn't have a computer at home. She worked for a small college in upstate New York. And she read it. And she came home and she said, David, you got to read this manifesto that was just published that the Unabomber wrote. It has all the same ideas of your goofy brother. Remember that document he sent you 20 years ago? It's exact. You need to read this. He said, no. And then she said, David, you know your brother wanted nothing to do with you and your mother. Again, he wrote your mother some of the filthiest, vilest letters telling her to stay away from him. He wrote you those letters saying, never, ever again contact me. I don't want anything to do with you. But guess what? Right before Thomas Mosher was killed, and then right before Gilbert Murray was killed, out of the clear blue sky, Ted Kaczynski sent his brother letters asking him to send him money. I need money. Can you send me $2,000? I need money. Can you send me $2,500? I'll quick claim deed the cabin to you if you will. Linda was fearful that they had financed the Unabomber's killing of the last two people. And she's correct. They had. Nothing she could have done about it. She didn't know. So she got David, like any good wife would. She grabbed him by the stack and swivel, screwed his little butt up and marched him down to the library, set him down at the computer, turned it on and said, read. David told Kathy Puckett and another agent, Lee Stark, when he did, the hair stood up on the back of his neck because he thoroughly believed his brother had written it. That's in September, folks. It took them all the way until late January to come to the FBI. They tried to do their own investigation, and I could talk for hours about that too, but I won't. But eventually, in late January, they got an attorney out of Washington, D.C., gave him the information. He had a relationship with an agent in Washington, D.C. He went to him to ask him about it. The agent was no longer in Washington, D.C. He lived in Charlotte, North Carolina. And he said, Tony, what can I do? I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina. We don't have a lot of Unabomber stuff here. He said, but here, Molly Flynn, take it to Molly. She's in Washington, D.C. She's the Unabomber agent there. And he did. He took it to her, the old document, the 21-page thing. It was typed on the antique typewriter. Molly took it to the FBI laboratory. FBI laboratory, in their infinite wisdom, examined it. They did a documents examination on the typewriter. It wasn't Smith Corona, circa 1925-30, Piper-style type 2.54 spacing. It was another old typewriter. No, can't be him. Give it back to Molly.
Oh, God.
Molly said, whoa. I read this, and I read the manifesto, the same ideas. She knew how big this case was and how much information we were getting in, that 89,000 volumes of stuff. So she picked up the phone and she called our office. And she got my counterpart, Joel Moss, on the line, and she told him about it. And Joel said, fax me a copy. And Joel got the copy. He got Terry, Kathy, and I. We went to lunch at Max's Diner right down the street, a highlight of the day, and read it. And all of them were all excited. I'm the old curmudgeon criminal guy. I don't believe it until I find the typewriter. That's the only forensic evidence. I'll believe it then. But tell me what to do, and we'll do. So to make a long story short, boom. They dispatched Kathy and Lee Stark back to talk to his brother and sister-in-law in New York. They dispatched a team of agents to go down to Texas, where David had a remote location where he had lots of letters and stuff stored from his brother. And I get all the choice assignments. I got sent to Montana in early February. Not a place we like to go. I got away from rural Nebraska just because of that, okay? The first day I got up there that night, it was 35 below in Lincoln, Montana. So, I told Jim, my boss, I'd accept that assignment on one condition, that he not do it the way traditionally we do it. And that's why the subtitle to our book. We did a lot of non-traditional things. And he said, what's that? I said, we can't throw manpower at it. I don't care how funny we dress. I don't care how great we talk. I don't care what our cover story is. Flooding a whole bunch of agents into rural Lincoln, Montana in the middle of winter isn't going to pass muster. They're going to know we're there. So he said, good, I came from a small New Mexico town, I agree. So in late January, this is what I saw. This is hustle and bustle of downtown Lincoln, Montana. Highway 200, the main street, which is a midway point between Missoula and Great Falls. Now the rule was, I took Dave Weber, who was a former Marine, young guy. He was a former principal firearms expert in this division, which is the job that I wrote the job description for and that I occupied during the 70s. And then I took a man-wife team. John Gray, well, they were really boyfriend, girlfriend, but back then in the Bureau, you couldn't say that, so you had to be man-wife. Team, John Gray and Candace DeLong. Two of the most unsuspecting FBI people you'd ever meet in your life, because I didn't think anybody would ever believe they were with the FBI. The four of us went, and this is what we were confronted with. A week later, I took Postal Inspector Paul Wilhelmus with us, and that was our team for the first couple months. The manifesto that he wrote in this facility, the Lincoln Library. The librarian's name was Sherry Wood. The man who detested computers and technology would go to the Lincoln Library, a double-wide trailer right off of Highway 200, and he would give her names to research online and get addresses. That's where he was getting the addresses of his victims. Sherry Wood was finding them for him on the computer. She told us later that he occupied the research section of the library for a really, really long period of time. One time she had to kick him out. The research section was a folding table at the back. And it was during the time that the kids across the street of the high school were doing their term papers, so they were all coming over and he dominated it. Well, what he was doing is he's writing the manifesto. He was smelly, dirty, and what have you. Sherry thought he was great, and she introduced him to her teenage son as a mentor.
Oh, God.
This is the main intersection of beautiful downtown Lincoln, Montana. The intersection of Stemple Pass Road, which is the road coming out towards you, and Highway 200. His cabin was 4.5 miles south of this intersection, and one of the first jobs I had to do when I got up there was to get a physical description and if I could, pictures of the cabin for the search warrant. You just don't go to court and say, hey, we want to search a cabin somewhere near Lincoln, Montana. You got to be specific. You got to have a description of it, better a photograph of it. You know, rural Route 4 is not a good address. You got to have a specific. So 4.5 miles south of this intersection is where David told us he lived. That is Stemple Pass Road, where you see Lincoln on there. That's Stemple Pass Road, Lincoln to the left. And you see up on top it says Mount Baldy. And then down below Mount Baldy you see another clear-cut spot. In between those two mountains is a canyon called Coldwater Creek Canyon, and it's a box canyon, and his cabin was up in Canyon Creek there in the back. He felt very comfortable in that canyon that no one could penetrate his security system, if you will, to get in and get to him in that canyon. This is an aerial view of his cabin. Now there's a barn down in the mouth of the cabin, down on the lower left-hand corner, that belonged to the Mason family. Then in the middle of the picture, in the clear, you see another cabin. That's the Williams cabin. That's an elk hunting cabin, which we rented to use during the arrest and search warrant. And Ted Kaczynski's cabin, you can't see it right there, but it's clear back in that stand of trees, about 50 yards, 60 yards, and if you look real close, show you here. That's hard to see. If you look real close, you see a little white thing. That's the roof of his cabin. It's very difficult to see from this aerial thing. Interesting. Technology. Everybody wants you to use technology, okay? I'm old-fashioned. I like to do stuff the old-fashioned way. Aha! How do we get a picture of it? Give the coordinates. Get the coordinates, Max. Take your GPS, brand new GPS, get the coordinates, give it to us, we'll give it to NSA, and when the satellite flies over, we'll give you pictures of the cabin. You can see a dime on the street corner in San Francisco and read the writing on it. Oh, yeah, okay. So they did. Off they go. Come back, we get these nice big black and white pictures. All we get is snow and trees. We've got an operation going on in eastern Montana on the Freeman group, the right-wing nuts that were over there protesting. We had the new FBI super secret high-flying airplane, Night Stalker, over there. Night Stalker flies at 10,000 feet. It's got FLIR equipment, it's got radar, it's got all this stuff. Great photograph. They'll get it for you. I developed the owner of the property right next to him, Butch Gearing, as an informant, if you will, a cooperating witness. And Butch was giving me all the information that I needed for all this stuff. And Butch comes up to me one day and says, "Hey Max, you get a good picture of me yesterday?" What do you mean, Butch, a good picture? He says, "Yeah, wasn't you guys flying up there about 10,000 feet? You ever, in the wilderness, in the mountains, you ever hear a Pratt-driven plane?" And Butch said, "I waved at you. I hope you got a good picture." I mean, Butch was right. It was us, you know. We got more big pictures back. Snow and trees. How do we get it? And another gentleman that I developed was a U.S. Forest Service officer, Jerry Burns. He was the most knowledgeable person in this area. Jerry said, "Well, that's simple. Mount Baldy up there has a big herd of elk on it. The Fish and Game people are always flying through that canyon with their little Cessna and monitoring that elk herd from poachers. He won't think anything about a little plane flying through there." Okay, one of the guys in our resident agency in Helena, J.R. McDonald, said, "Yeah, I'm a pilot in chief for the Bureau. I can rent a plane and we can do that." Great. Gave Dave Weber, my young partner, Nike 35mm camera, 200mm lens. Off they go in the round blue yonder, hung Dave out the window, and we got these pictures for the search warrant to give to the judge when we presented it to him. That's his cabin, a little closer view. As you can see when you enlarge that, you see the top of the cabin there in white. It was in a stand of lodgepole pine, very difficult to see. This is the entrance to that property, and you see Bald Mountain up behind there. And you turn to the left, you go to Butch Gearing's lumber mill. You turn to the right, and you go up the canyon to Kaczynski's place. Even though this is, well, these pictures were taken in late February, I believe, or early February. Now, this is Stumble Pass Road right across the street from that entrance. And you see a band or a series of mailboxes. And this, in the technical terms of the FBI, is a clue. When I saw that mailbox, I knew we were in the right area, okay? Now it's just a matter of getting those photographs. This is Butch Gearing's lumber mill. This is not a sophisticated operation. It's a one-man operation. He was going up on the mountain that he owned behind Kaczynski's property. His father had sold Kaczynski his 1.4 acres that his cabin's on. He would go up there, he would skid logs off, bring it down here, and make custom fences, custom lumber for people up in that area. And Butch was a great guy. That's Butch. And without Butch's help, we'd still be up there looking, believe me. Jerry Burns and Butch, again, old-fashioned. Informants and cooperating witnesses and the help of the public go a long, long way. Sophistication sometimes just doesn't work. There's the skid road leading up toward Ted Kaczynski's cabin, which is another half mile, 3/4 of a mile up that property. That is Stumble Pass Road. That goes up over the Continental Divide and eventually down into Helena, Montana. And that's what we were faced with when we were up there. Very difficult period of time, lots of snow, lots of cold weather. Someone said, Jerry said, Burns, the Forest Service officer, that's him on the right. We can use the Forest Service snowmobiles, and we can go up on the Humbug Contour Trail above his cabin and creepy crawl down through the snow and get a picture of it. And so they did. That's me in the Blue Park. I supervise that operation. I don't like to creepy crawl down through snow banks in the middle of the mountains. So they did. As they neared the cabin, before they could really see it, they heard the cabin door open and close. They said, uh-oh, so they left. And they got back out and left. Later in the afternoon, after I had arrested him and had him in my custody, he looked me in out of the clear blue sky and said, "Was that you fellers up on the Humbug Contour Trail back in February?" I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "I saw evidence of motorized vehicle and tracks leading down toward my cabin. I think that was you." Well, it was. But I was very proud because he didn't recognize us for what we were, even though he knew someone was there. This is a trail right outside his cabin, the skid road. It comes right up here and makes a right-hand turn and goes on up the mountain. That's his cabin. It was a 10 by 12 foot single wall construction cabin, no insulation, no running water, and no electricity.
Wow.
Contrary to what all the experts told us about all the electrical equipment he had to have, the saws and the planes and the whatever, he was doing everything by hand. Everything he manufactured was by hand. They said he needed to have a kiln, a home kiln, because he was melting aluminum, which melts at, I think they said, 1,300 degrees centigrade. We went to Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, Oak Ridge National Laboratory, the American Aluminum Association said, he's got to have a kiln to do that. You can't melt aluminum without a kiln. So we had a project that was looking at everybody in the United States in the last 5 years that had bought kilns. I'll show you where he was melting his aluminum on. That's the front door to his cabin looking in. And if you look straight to the back, what do you see? A pot-bellied stove fed by logs. Guess where the aluminum was being melted? On that pot-bellied stove. That was his only source of heat. In the wintertime, I was up there from late January until April when we served the warrant. I never saw him once step outside the confines of his 1.4 acres. He was always there. He was in there. As an aside, so you understand what a piece of work this guy was, he had a piece of plywood on the floor in the middle of the cabin, and when he needed to urinate, he'd move it over and he'd pee on the ground underneath his cabin, and he'd cover it back up. When he had to have a bowel movement, he'd put a bunch of newspaper down, have a bowel movement, wrap it up, and stick it in the fire and burn it. You can imagine what that cabin's heat smelled like. Then we discovered an interesting thing too. Right outside the cabin, he had a 50-gallon barrel. His honey barrel, he called it. In the summertime, that's where he put all of his urine and his excrement, because he used that to fertilize his garden. And his neighbors couldn't understand why he could grow such big carrots. They used to bring to him. They were appalled when they found out. That's his workbench inside the cabin, where he built all these devices. No sophistication whatsoever, all by hand, contrary to what all the experts told us. We went to every, you wouldn't believe the experts that we used, and everybody. There's a pot-bellied stove. You see the gray hooded sweatshirt hanging on the wall back there. All of these containers on these shelves all contain bomb-making parts that he found on his forays when he would go out in summertime. This is his sleeping platform. We're almost all the way around 360. You see his stuff that was hanging beside the front door, the edge of his snowshoes. This is his sleeping platform. It's a 1-inch piece of foam with a green army blanket, and you see all the smudges on the wall where he would lean up against it because his only chair is that thing in the middle there, and it wasn't very comfortable. So he'd sit on there and lean up against the wall, and when the fire was smoldering and it wasn't drawing correctly, all that smudge would come out, and that's what's on the wall there. One of the very last things we found in that cabin is right back there in the corner. Now, when he said that he would desist killing people if we published his manifesto, he reserved the right to commit acts of sabotage. And he defined that as being terrorism, being to kill people. He wouldn't kill anymore, but he'd still blow up buildings and bridges and infrastructure and what have you. Well, this bomb was back under his bed. He'd been in there all the time I was up there building this bomb. We suspected as much, and we know who it was going to, and it was the most sophisticated bomb yet that he built. And guess what, folks? It was an anti-personnel bomb. It had 454 pieces of individual shrapnel he manufactured, filed down, and epoxy resin to the outside of that bomb. So contrary to what all the behavioral scientists told us, he wasn't going to keep his word. On his wall, within arm's reach of him, was a 22 and a 30-06. He also had a homemade zip gun that he made because he was getting ready to kill people with a gun. This is a picture of the loft. It took 9 days to search his cabin, folks. The ERT people and the explosive bomb people just didn't enter the front door of the cabin of the most successful booby trapper in the world in the history of the United States. They went around the back, went up above, cut a hole, and came in through the loft here, and then worked their way down. One of the very last things they searched was that ammo tin right in the middle. There's a picture of it. And what was in that ammo tin?
Wow,
A Smith Corona, circa 1925 to 30 typewriter with 2.54 spacing and Pica style type. He also had two other old typewriters in there. One he used for correspondence with his family, one he used for correspondence for business and the newspapers and what have you. And we had our documents examiner from DC out there. He took a sample at the scene, and we knew that we had the correct man at that time. This is an adjacent cabin, the Miller cabin, which we put some agents in the last few days to ensure that he didn't get out of there. The two-agent man-wife team, they were stationed in Lincoln for the last 10 days watching the buses. There's only two ways out of Lincoln, Montana if you don't have a car. And he didn't have a car, he had a bicycle. And that was, and we determined he was using the bus lines, Rim Rock Trailways, eastbound from Missoula to Great Falls at 4 o'clock, and Rim Rock Trailways westbound at 7 o'clock from Great Falls to Missoula, and we ensured those two agents were always there seeing that he didn't leave. We also had two agents stationed in Missoula and two agents in Great Falls, and watching for him as we knew where he stayed when he went those places. That's my boss, Jim Freeman, in the red, white, and blue, co-author of the book. And that's Terry Churchy, my immediate supervisor. This is the Williams cabin, which was adjacent. This is the inside of that Williams cabin where we held him in investigative detention because all we had was a search warrant. He kept asking me all the questions. Can you loosen my handcuffs? No. Can you take my handcuffs off? No. Can I stand up and walk around the room? No. Can I go outside and get some fresh air? No. Kind of sounds like I'm under arrest, which in essence he was, but we didn't get authorization to arrest him until a little after 5 that night. This is 7-Up Ranch and Resort. This is where our headquarters was. It was owned by the Cashman family. We hung out there a lot because they got a great chicken fried steak. And a super bar and bartender. Wayne Cashman's son-in-law was great. And it was far enough away that we felt comfortable being there. That's a picture of myself on the blue parka and Tom McDaniel from the Helena Resident Agency. We're changing his status. Right after that picture of Terry and Jim outside the cabin, they authorized me to put him officially under arrest at about 5:10 at night, which is what we've just done. We took the handcuffs off and we're putting him in a transportation chain to take him to 70 miles away to Helena to book him in. We got to Helena. Long story, don't have time, I'm on my time. We didn't take him to book him in Lewis and Clark, we took him to the resident agency where a great battle went on because the attorney at the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. was getting bad information from someone, and he called out and told us that we were instructed that we did not have his authority to arrest this gentleman, to release him and let him go. We take the results of the search into a grand jury and get an indictment and go back and get him later. And I told Terry, it ain't gonna happen. If I got to take him home to the Colonial Inn tonight and handcuff him to the bottom of my bed, I'm going to do it. It took us 17 years to find him, and we're not about it. So it took Terry and Jim through the night till after 11 o'clock that night to get Louis Free out of bed, to get Janet Reno up, to get Janet Reno to tell this attorney, Roberts, back in DOJ headquarters, to back off of his order, and that we were authorized to book him into jail. That's a picture, and there's a big story behind this, but this was on the cover of Newsweek magazine. There's his official arrest photo after he was cleaned up a little bit. Everybody asked about his cabin. His cabin is now, my crew, my agents used a chainsaw, cover off his foundation. We got Butch Gearing's front-end loader, loaded it up, put it on skids, pulled it off the mountain, pulled it down, took it down to Mountain from Air Force Base, and it's now as a major exhibit at the Museum in Washington, D.C. So if you go back there, it's back there. You can experience it. It's 10, less than 10 by 12 inside. We just worked with them recently, and they're doing a virtual reality tour of it based upon photographs that we provided to them and so forth. And it's very interesting. The Bureau loaned it to them after 9/11 because the Bureau tour had to close down. We had the manpower headquarters to maintain our tour, and the museum was opening. And now the Bureau has opened their tour at an offsite, and they went back and asked for the cannon back, and the museum said, screw you, it's one of our most popular exhibits. So, okay, folks, I run over a little bit, I'm sorry.